MPs, as you know, from all parties worked for months on studying the issue, and then they made recommendations to the government on how to change the system. So how are they reacting to today's news? Joining me now from the foyer of the House of Commons, the Conservative critic for democratic institutions, Scott Reid, the NDP's Democratic Reform critic, Nathan Cullen. Okay, good to see you both, fellas. So we talked, obviously, to the minister who makes the case that this is not a promise that has been broken. This is the acceptance that there was no consensus from Canadians about what happened next, and that Canadians are okay with the state of democracy as it is now. Nathan Cullen, you can start off on what you make of the justification the minister is giving for this.
I got to say, from start to finish, this whole thing has been pathetic, actually. The arguments for months now, sometimes behind closed doors, sometimes more public, have been from a government that simply wanted to break their promise because they didn't like what the implications of that promise was. Mr. Trudeau was clear on literally hundreds of occasions. This was the last election under the outdated, unfair system, and there's going to be a new one. They set up the committee. We helped set up the committee. MPs went out, you know about all the consultations and everything else. And what the committee heard, and I think Scott can confirm this, is that those seeking change, it was overwhelmingly in support, both from experts and average, ordinary Canadians who came to the committee, that they wanted a proportional system. Mr. Trudeau in the House today said, well, he had a system he preferred, so-called alternative vote, which, coincidentally, does really, really well for Liberals, and there's no evidence for it. Not seeing that he was getting his option, his preference, his Liberal preference, then it's time to abandon ship and break that promise. But to say that they didn't betray that promise to Canadians, I mean, come on. This was clear, it was black and white. And today the minister and the prime minister went out and said, never mind, you're going to have to trust us one more time.
So that's Nathan Cullen's interpretation of what happened. Scott Reid, what is your understand? What do you think was the motivation, why they did this, and when do you think they did it? I mean, do you think that the intent was ever there to make this happen?
Well, I think there are probably a couple of stages here. The intent initially, back when Mr. Trudeau announced this policy in June of 2015 and made the dramatic statement that 2015 will be the last election to first past the post. I mean, the intent there was to win swing votes from the New Democrats. There is no ambiguity about that. He stole the policy word for word from the New Democrats.
That's true.
Then when they got in power, it came into the throne speech again. I think the motivation then was different. I think then Mr. Trudeau realized we have a potential with the majority to push through a preferential ballot system that would consistently, election after election, cause more Liberals to be elected, even if the number of votes is the same. But there's no support across the country for that. And I think once that became evident, and it was really striking how little support there is for the preferential ballot, that I think then he was looking for an exit, and I think that's the motivation.
Would it have, I mean, I know everybody did lots of work in listening on things, but would it have been better to have a clear formula, a clear notion out there for Canadians to weigh in on if the goal was to build consensus? Would a clearer, proposal have helped in that goal? Nathan?
Potentially, for sure. And so in our conversations with the other parties, we were putting elements like what you just said, Rosie. What would a system look like? If you're going to go proportional, how proportional? Would it be 30% of the House of Commons? Would it be 20? Do you want to do this in stages over time? We went to the Liberals that way, not to disrupt even the incumbents who are in there right now. I mean, every time the Liberals put forward some sort of problem that they had, we came up with a solution, and then they'd just go find another problem, and you'd come up with a solution to that, and they'd go find it, and to the point where they just didn't say anything at all. And so how do you negotiate with that? Like, it becomes somewhat clear after a time that they just don't want to do it, and they're looking for a way. I met with the minister yesterday afternoon. She asked me for my input on electoral reform. I sat in her office, and she said, I'd like to hear your ideas.
Yesterday?
Yesterday afternoon, hours before what she did here today. I mean, this is what we've been dealing with. And at some point, I mean, I'm hopeful, but I'm not stupid. And you sit back and you say, well, Canadians, a lot of them, as Scott said, may have lent their vote to the Liberals in the last election, whatever. But if you have a promise this clear from a prime minister who's willing to break it, then what does any promise mean from the guy? And what I watched today from the prime minister talking about instability in the Canadian electorate, and this would cause, like, I mean, give me a break. Canadians can handle this conversation. We clearly did.
So, Scott Reid, was there anything that the committee could have done that would have helped to sort of focus the direction and to prevent the government from saying what it said today, that there was no broad consensus, that there was no clear path forward?
There was a consensus. Back in November, I circulated a memorandum to all committee members pointing out that if each party stuck to its stated bottom line, didn't give up anything that it had said was a bottom line for it, but showed a willingness to compromise and everything else, we could achieve a consensus. So the Liberals at that point said they were open to any system as long as it could be put in by 2019, because that was their sacred promise. The NDP wanted proportionality, we wanted a referendum, and we actually designed a report that would have allowed all of those things to be fulfilled, and we also gave the government the option of choosing at its discretion which of the systems that it thought was best implemented. It could be STV, it could be multi-member proportional, as long as it met with a Gallagher index of 5 or less, which is a way of measuring proportionality. So what we really said was very clearly proportional as long as it goes to a referendum, and it can be implemented by 2019. We were very careful about that. So they abandoned their bottom line after the fact, and that they changed the conditions and made up a condition that had not previously existed.
Okay, so I need to end on this, but there was a poll done by Angus Reid in November that said that 66% of Canadians said, changing the system as a priority pretty low. So is that sort of what the government is banking on here, that most Canadians are not going to take to the streets, that this is something they are walking away from? And if that's the case, then what do you do? Because there's not much political leverage here for you at all.
So how cynical is that, in that a Prime Minister would sit in the office just above us here and say, show me the polling numbers on my promises, which ones don't rank high enough that I can then break, as opposed to a Prime Minister with courage and integrity to say, I got elected on this thing, this is important to me, and oh, by the way, we can do it. Finding consensus and agreement amongst all these parties with all these different interests is not easy. Liberals were uninterested in doing it. So if you pull back and say, oh, Canadians are not interested, therefore, everything we care about, good jobs, the environment, international policy, all of it rests on how we vote. This is core. People didn't wake up this morning across Canada wondering about STV versus MMP. That's the job of legislators, to put an option forward and then advocate for it, like every other policy government comes up with. So here was the opportunity to see that courage from the Liberals, and instead all we saw was the backtracking and the lies and the mess that we see here today. It's just, I guess I just want to say that Mr. Trudeau said he was in politics to lower cynicism, to bring more people in, young people in, to show them that politics could be done with integrity. Well, that Justin Trudeau and this Justin Trudeau are unrecognizable to each other, and I wish for the other guy, because I like the idea of being able to work progressively on things together. And that, by the way, polling-wise, Rosie, is one of the strongest things Canadians want, is they want us to find ways to work together as MPs to get things done. That is across the political spectrum.
And not to be cynical here, but I will say this, this does open up some space for an NDP that maybe needs to build back. So, if you're looking for NDP silver linings in terms of political positioning.
Maybe, but I take no satisfaction in this, because the core principle and the idea is that we all stand for office. We have platforms which are our promises to Canadians. We then go try to make those platforms happen in policy if we're so fortunate as to be elected.
Okay.
If you undermine that, then that's all that cynicism that Mr. Trudeau talked about, only getting bigger and bigger, and that is most unfortunate.
Okay, Scott Reid, last word.
What he said. No, to me, what's happened here is this is Justin Trudeau's equivalent of the moment at which George Bush Sr. broke his "read my lips, no new taxes" policy.
So it's so clear.
Yeah, that's right. It's a crystal clear promise that is then broken, and it's not that everybody was hung up on this. It was that how in the next election, when he makes another promise that sounds really good to you, how do you know he's actually going to follow through on it?
Okay.
Well, you don't.
Gentlemen, you're always welcome back, whether the electoral reform happens or not. Appreciate it. Scott Reid, Nathan Cullen. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Rosie.